Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Adamski, and this is my separation of church and state presentation for EDU 574-0324 for Dr. Catherine Heller of Gwynedd Mercy University. What you see before you is the table of contents of everything that we will be talking about. First, we will start by defining separation of church and state. Then, we will discuss the importance of that separation between church and state. Then, over the next few slides, we will discuss the legality of religion in public schools and the legal lines surrounding religious clubs in particular. Then, we will briefly discuss some of the prevalent Supreme Court cases involving religion in public schools. Then, we will close things out with a few words of wisdom on where we go from here, and I'll leave it open to questions and comments to continue the discourse. All right, let's get into it. Callaway defines separation of church and state as Congress making no law respecting an establishment of religion. What this really means is that because the words separation of church and state are never expressly written in the Constitution, what this really actually means is that no government entity or governmentally or publicly funded entity may sponsor a specific religion or religious belief. To further explain why it's so important to keep church and state separate, we need to look back at our nation's roots and the founding of our nation. The United States founders were committed to a government not overtly entangled with religion, according to Callaway. The United States was a nation that was founded on the idea that anyone may practice any faith without fear of governmental retribution. And according to Dayton 2019, the First Amendment's Establishment Clause declares that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But just because we have to keep church and state separate, that does not necessarily mean that religion cannot be present in public schools. So, some common questions that might be asked with regard to the legality of religion in public schools. Is religion allowed in public schools? Well, certainly yes, they are, but under certain specific conditions. We'll get into this a little bit more later when talking about court cases involving religion in public schools. But for example, the school cannot mandate that students pray at the beginning of the school day, and schools cannot require students to participate in religious rituals. Another common question that might be asked is, can students or staff pray at school? Yes. The answer is yes, but only if done in private. Now, going back to my example of the prayer at the beginning of the school day, because that is a overt act in front of everyone in public, it is not necessarily allowed because it could be seen as a endorsement by the institution of that particular religion. And that point leads us to the final question. Can students or staff pray before a sporting event? The quick answer is no. And that's due to the fact that the public prayer could be seen as an endorsement of the specific religious faith by the institution. As you can see, religion does have its place in public schools, but it is under very specific conditions, and one must walk that fine line between free speech and unprotected free speech. Speaking of legal lines, let's discuss the legal line surrounding religious clubs. Just like any other club, religious clubs may be formed and students may assemble for a religious club in the school setting. The caveat being that the school club must take place during after-school hours. The school administration may not interfere in any way with regard to the operation of the club, meaning the administration, whether that's the principal, the superintendent, or anyone else involved with the operation of the school, may not encourage participation, may not encourage members of the student body or staff to join said club, and it may not actively participate in finding chaperones for the club. With that in mind, thinking equally, you would think that if a school administration is allowing a religious club to form and assemble on school campus, that they would be required to have a club for all kinds of religions, and that's just not true. because the inclusion of a religious club is not necessarily seen legally as an endorsement of a particular religion or faith, but the requirement of all religions to be represented may be seen as an endorsement of those other faiths. So school administration may not require all faiths to form a club and gather. And finally, the club may not be compulsory, meaning that attendance must be held on a voluntary basis, which connects back to the previous point of there not necessarily needing to be a requirement for all forms of religion to have their own club. It is quite a bit of a tightrope act that one must walk with regard to hosting clubs in the school setting on school campus, so caution is required when it comes to the inclusion of clubs. Here's a short list of some of the prominent cases involving religion in public schools. The first case is Engel v. Vitale of 1962. This was the case where students were required to say a non-denominational prayer at the very beginning of the school day. The Supreme Court found that it was unconstitutional and illegal to require students at the beginning of the day to recite a prayer, regardless of whether it was a non-denominational and non-specific prayer, due to it being a violation of the First Amendment right of freedom of speech and expression. The next two cases, being Abington v. Shemp and Murray v. Curlett, was a combined case that the Supreme Court had taken a look at in 1963. The reason why they were combined in the same Supreme Court case was due to the fact that both of these individual cases had a similar grievance that was being addressed. In this case, the issue at hand was that the school was requiring students to study Bible verses and read them aloud every school day. And while the school had provided opportunities for the students to remove themselves from this morning ritual, it was deemed a violation of the First Amendment rights of the students affected. In the case of Lamb's Chapel v. Center Moriches Union Free School District, Lamb's Chapel wanted to host an after-school program in the Center Moriches Union Free School District where they would host a set of sessions where they would watch videos pertaining to family-oriented values from a Christian perspective. Now, because this is a after-school program that would have been considered non-compulsory and by voluntary attendance, this was actually considered allowed by the Supreme Court. And another specific court case dealing with an after-school club of a religious nature was Good News Club v. Milford Central School. To me, I believe that this is one of the biggest cases with regard to religious clubs meeting at a public school, because this case was centered around a couple who wanted to host an after-school program where they invited students to read Bible verses and sing religious songs and gather voluntarily. And so in this case, it was also deemed acceptable that this club was to gather and assemble on school campus. With all of that, where do we go from here? When it comes to free speech and religion in public schools, care must be taken. The simple fact of the matter is, public schools are considered government entities, and it is important that schools do not appear to endorse a particular faith. Any action that would be deemed as possibly an endorsement by a reasonable person, and what that might look like is that if a reasonable person views the facts as is and could possibly make the determination that the action or the speech was an endorsement by a public or government entity, that it would be a endorsement of that faith. So, like I said, it is a bit of a fine line that must be walked. To close things out, I would like to present you with a situation. In this scenario, a student believes that behaviors around the school would improve if they shared their faith by proselytizing on school grounds after school during dismissal, citing that God will teach my peers good morals. I'm interested to know your thoughts on how you would handle this situation and if this would be allowed on school grounds. Let's continue the discussion. You can feel free to submit the answer to the previous question posed on the previous slide, or any other questions for clarification or comments to me by email. My email is listed below. Here's the list of references that I used to create this presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you later. Thanks.